Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
And thank you for joining us for the sixth of our philosophy theology lectures this year. My name is Sister Anita Holzmer, and I am a faculty member of the Department of Philosophy Theology, as well as the director of the Center for Franciscan Spirit and Life. It is my pleasure and privilege to introduce to you our speaker. Earl Kumfer is a Fort Wayne native, and for many years, many happy years, he has been married to Nancy, who is a primary teacher in Montessori and preschool. Empty nesters now, Earl and Nancy are the parents of 4 successful adult children, and they have 3 preschool granddaughters. Earl has been on the faculty at USF longer than anyone can remember, and he's been boomeranging back and forth several times since he started here back in the 60s. His credentials are impressive and enviable. A Basilian Scholar at Catholic University of America, A.B. and M.A. in philosophy, Ph.D. from Southern Illinois University in Carbondale, and Fellow of the Midwest Region and Science Society, Religion and Science Society, currently focusing on human consciousness, the first and third person perspectives. Earl finds himself involved in numerous, perhaps too many for his own good, activities, some scholarly and some not, some remunerated and some volunteer. He is a full professor of philosophy and theology here at USF and is currently the department chair. Ergo, he's my boss and I have to say nice things about him. He is an ethics consultant to local hospitals and hospice. Earl is an active member of St. John the Baptist Parish, and he has also has been involved at the local, regional, and national levels with the Boy Scouts of America. You'd want to have Earl with you in a strange forest with only a compass and few provisions. This afternoon, our eminently qualified presenter, that is my boss, my colleague, and a very good friend, will share with us his research, reflections, and musings on the scintillating topic of Darksuckers and non-being. Dr. Earl Kumfer.
I hope you all picked up the only outline that exists for this. There are a couple of notes and a couple of references on there if you would like to use that. This has been a kind of a fun topic. It started in 1962. My major prof walked into class at one point and said, for Thursday, I want you all to write 500 words on nothing. So we did. And then he took that and we bounced it around and tore it apart and put it together again. And then published that under his name in the new Catholic Encyclopedia. So if you look under non-being, you see some of what I was writing before I got smart enough to know better to do that. This has been a topic that's been bouncing around in our house for quite some time, so about every pun that we could think of, that you could think of, has landed on one of us. As I'd be doing something, working away, Nancy would say, "What are you doing?" And I say, "Nothing." "Well, then you've got time to..." "No, I don't. I'm working on nothing." Those kinds of things have been going on for several months now. To try to create some curiosity and to set a context for humor, as people have asked me about this talk, I've been deliberately obscure. Oral responses have often been just the single word, nothing, to which everyone kind of chuckles. And without exception, I noticed those chuckles were sometimes serious, sometimes a little bit nervous. But they had the effect of abrupt end of that conversation. Philosophers love koans, so we kind of enjoy when we have an opportunity to use a pun like that to stop people from thinking. So be forewarned, it's probably going to happen. There's going to be a lot of accidental puns that you will think of and chuckle, and we won't know what it's about. And that's fine as we take a look at what I think is probably not at all, for philosophers, a boring topic. Today I aim to play with your mental blocks, to point out a few presuppositions that may well ground your worldview, and in the process may cause a little tremor in the way you put your picture of the world together. I'm not particularly interested in persuading you to any one view. In fact, I'm very interested in avoiding all the train wrecks that have happened in the history of philosophy over this topic. I'm not sure that I want to repeat any of those or to add to the damage that they've caused. I anticipated, and I see it's confirmed, that there's quite a mix of folks here. There are professional philosophers in the room. There are students who are probably here to get extra credit and they don't care what the topic is. And there are some supportive friends. And then there are others. So your interests are going to be multiple. This could be dangerous, but the sun will go down, and by that time the danger will have passed. I invite you this afternoon into the world of ontology. That is a specialized area within metaphysics. It's at the very core of metaphysics. And most of the time in philosophy, we desperately stay away from this area because, first of all, it's mentally dangerous. People have gone crazy. There are historians that have pointed out various philosophers who dabbled in this area too long. It's also an area in which there are no presuppositions. In fact, the nature of ontology is to explore some of those fundamental assumptions that philosophers make in the doing of philosophy. There are no rules. There's only wonder and curiosity, and more often than not, amazement. Despite all the jokes or paradoxes that we may stumble into, I've decided to speak briefly on a number of separate topics, but to give you a taste of what nothing is like in a variety of forms. So today I want to discuss a bit about what dark is, about silence, space, zero. All of them are variations on the theme of non-being. So let's begin. I'm going to warm you up with a couple of koans. Well, actually, they're called riddles. Some of these you may, especially if you have children who have read The Hobbit recently, or if you remember reading The Hobbit a couple of times, you will remember some of these riddles. The first one is just a warm-up riddle. These kinds of riddles, as J.R.R. Tolkien uses them, I think are meant to be fun, are meant to stretch the imagination, are meant to create excitement of an intellectual way. In The Hobbit, they're used as ways to avoid danger or ways to get passage into or out of a dangerous situation. The first one was spoken by Bilbo Baggins. You remember as being the behind-the-scenes hero in The Lord of the Rings. But he's up front and center in The Hobbit, which was a prequel of a sort. And the first of the riddles is this. What's the answer? Pardon? Egg. And I chose that one because that's one of the oldest ontological images, one of the oldest metaphors. If you look back in very, very ancient writing in some of the poetry in ancient Greece, the universe was perceived to be an egg for all sorts of reasons. One of those is that it was curved, which they realized it had to be. And ironically, when we look at some of the new work that's going on in physics, the normal pictures of seeing the universe portrayed as being spherical are usually set aside. There are usually spheres with bulges in them, some of them looking very much like eggs. I don't want to skip that second one. This one you may have seen on your computer. It was originally written by Joseph Lemmings a number of years ago, and about every 6 months it shows back up. Some friend of mine sends me a copy of this cool riddle that someone just sent them. A little tougher. It's a little longer. It's 9 riddles in one. all having the same answer. Someone will get it sooner, and the rest of you will all get flattened foreheads because it was so obvious. No. Pardon? Nothing. It's too easy. This is the title of this talk. What does a man love more than life? Nothing. What do the poor have? Nothing. 9 separate clues woven together into one longer riddle. But I saved where we're going to start for last. This also comes from Tolkien. Gollum, the character in both of those major works of his, speaks this. Coming? Dark. It's dark. I'm going to turn that off. We don't need that for a little bit. She is the younger sister of nothing, one of the variations on nothing. And I would like to start our discussion with different kinds of non-being with the notion of dark. Dark is the first form of non-being that we're going to be talking about today. Apparently, human beings are very conscious of it already. In developmental psychologists, they say this is already in the womb, in utero. There are experiences of light and dark, and that babies seem to be responding to the change in directions of that. We're all shocked by the varieties of dark when we explore night wilderness. If you've ever been in a cave for any period of time, the underworld, we think of outer space as being dark. We think of extreme inner space as being dark. What goes on between the electrons in an atom, where it's too small for color spectrum? Is it dark or is it fully lit? How do you imagine that? We use it easily as a metaphor for evil, for sin, for death. We think of the lights going off sometimes when we think of dying, rather than the lights going on. I mean, why do we use one metaphor? Why do we have one image rather than another? It's because of this elaboration, this kaleidoscope of images that we associate with some of these basic concepts. Since the 12th century revival of empirical science, we've often explained dark in terms of our understanding of light and optics. The dark is seen as a deviation or a deprivation of light, that it's the lights going out, essentially, that begins already in some of those studies in optics long before the Enlightenment period. But to make this a bit more fun, let me share a campfire talk with you. The thrust of this story, which they cause us commissioners to come in for and do once in a while, is campers, Boy Scouts, seem to have a predilection for fire. They're fascinated with fire. And when they're cut loose from parents, they start doing strange things with fire, including taking them into tents. I don't know if you've ever seen a tent burn, but it takes 20 seconds for a tent to burn. That's not enough time to get out. It's certainly not enough time to get in and grab anything, including your buddy, and get him out. So we try to do something interesting. You can't scare them to death. Boy Scouts are just not scarable. We teach them to be self-sufficient, to be able to handle themselves. So there's a story that some of us had developed probably about 20 years ago that goes something like this. And I hope you have your sense of humor. Those of you who are scientists, if you would hold your hands over your ears so that your blood pressure does not rise, because we tell the kids that despite what they heard in school, these are not flashlights, they're Darksuckers. And despite what they heard in school, these work differently than they think or than they've been told. Inside of one of these, there is a bulb and a bunch of canisters. And these canisters are almost full, so the light doesn't work very well because, well, first of all, it's not light. This is a darksucker. When you turn this on, what it does is it sucks dark into this little thing and stores it in the canisters. And when you turn it off, it stops sucking. And when it gets full, and if you ever tore open a battery, it's very dark stuff that's in there. So all the dark collects in there, fills one of those up, and you either take it and they call it recharging, but they ought to call it re-emptying the dark that was in there, right? Darksuckers come in a variety of sizes and shapes. We don't have very many on in here, so I brought a darksucker. This is a serious darksucker. In fact, this one will suck dark from about 300 yards away. There's a kind of a cone of dark that is being sucked right into this big darksucker because it's got a battery in it. There are primitive darksuckers. In fact, the very primitive, most primitive, is a little bit of a fire that's in the campfire. We don't want any of the kids to get too close because if it sucks too much dark away from them, they will turn into darksuckers and flare up because they won't have any dark left in them. It'll suck it right out of them, and that friction causes heat. You know that this is the way it works, Sister Carol, because right now this is a new taper, and the wick is white. So if we would light this with another little darksucker flame, and it would start sucking, what would happen to that little wick? It would turn dark because the dark would be gathered there. And if you put a pencil or something close to it when it's on, when it's doing its dark sucking, the pencil will also get dark because it interferes with some of that dark that's being sucked into the candle, right? So dark exists, doesn't it? Dark is an object, isn't it? It's inside those little canisters. So the first aspect of this new science, of this new understanding of science, is that darksuckers suck dark, and dark is real. In fact, there's a big darksucker, a celestial darksucker, that's up above this building, several 100,000 miles away from us right now. And since about 6:30 this morning, it's been sucking dark off of our side of the planet. And as our planet turns, it'll continue sucking dark while we're in the dark. When it's sucking it away from us, it's actually sucking dark toward us when we're on the dark side of the sun, because the sun is just a darksucker. Once in a while, the sun overdoes it. It super sucks too much. And astronomers have noticed there are black spots where so much dark got so compacted it couldn't get into the sun. So those dark spots radiate some of that dark. In fact, it spits it back out into the universe, which causes communication problems with satellites. The second principle is that darksuckers don't last forever. This darksucker probably would last for an hour and a half, and it would have sucked so much dark that would have, and the heat, which is another principle we'll come to in a moment, will have melted all of that was protecting that white thing so it didn't get overloaded with dark. And we already talked about the batteries. The third principle is that dark has mass, which ought to convince those who were in doubt up until now that it was a real thing. Anything that has mass has to be real, right? It does have mass. When that dark is getting sucked into the darksucker, the friction of that dark passing into the wick causes heat. So the mass, and depending on the volume, if you've got a big darksucker, you're going to have more heat. A big bonfire in the middle of the campsite is really going to get hot, and you can't get too close to it because that heat is going to turn you into a darksucker if you're not careful. So 3 or 4 times in this talk, we're really doing safety teaching as part of the process of this. And even though another feature of mass is there's an infinite amount of mass here apparently, because even though the sun's been operating for quite some time and man-made darksuckers have been operating for several tens or 20,000s of years since we invented fire, we haven't exhausted all the dark in the universe yet. So there's a lot of it out there, and modern science might agree with that. The fourth principle is that dark is heavier than light. Another physical quality feature, right? If you ever went swimming and you swam on the surface and just a little bit below the surface, you could open your eyes, unless you were in a very polluted lake or a river, you would see lots and lots and lots of stuff. And then if you start swimming down and you get down about a half a mile, as you go down, it gets darker and darker and darker. An obvious explanation. Dark is heavier than light, so it sinks to the bottoms of the lakes and the oceans. And the other stuff is called light because it's lighter and it floats on the top or drifts off into the sky, which is probably where the word light came from. Fifth, dark travels faster than light. It's faster than the speed of light. You hadn't noticed that because you can't blink that fast. If you were to stand in a closed, darkened closet, and scouts, I've seen them do this. They go over to the latrine and they check it out later at night to see if it's really true. You can hear the door slamming several times. If you're inside a darkened closet and you slowly open the door a little crack at a time, you will see that light comes in very, very quickly, and as you get it wider, more and more light comes in. But you never see the dark leave because it's faster than the light coming in. We could go on, corrosive nature of dark, and a whole host of other kinds of things that we can take from physics and apply here. What fascinates me is that it's not just the kids, it's some of the other scout leaders after this is over will come over and they'll say, how do you know that isn't true? It makes perfectly good sense. The more you push the metaphor, the more possibilities emerge. If you're a little bit creative, it would seem like there's as much or more dark than there is light, that despite what Newton said, the bigger picture is that light and dark are both real, and they're both taking up or try to take up the same amount of space. So I just leave them with that. I say, I'm not a scientist. I'm a philosopher, theologian, and I don't do science. This is about as much science as I can handle. So they let it go. For a philosopher, though, I think this does create an interesting kind of thing, because most philosophers are going to say that dark and all other critters like this that I would want to label as non-being do not have any being or existence of their own, that they are only privations or the absence of something else. And in that sense, they only have a borrowed ontology. They only have a borrowed reality. And despite the fact that many philosophers would argue that, I suggest that's not true. So there's some questions that I pose to you. Is dark itself a reality? Not just is it a real thing in experience, but is it a thing even if you're not looking? Is it the absence of light? It certainly seems to fit that description. Newton and others since have found that to work, to develop coherent theory. Is it light or simply the deprivation of light? Is it the degrees of the absence of light that are the degrees of darkness and so on? One test for this, philosophical test, Sister Carol, this is not a scientific empirical test, so it won't work in the lab, but it can work in our minds. When we see dark, are we seeing nothing? Or are we seeing a kind of something? Newton tells us that darkness is the absence of light, or said another way, that dark is the deprivation of light. When we are in the dark, I would posit, against Newton, that we do see dark. We do see something that exists, more than just being the absence of light. I propose that in pitch darkness, we at least see the darkness. And I'm not trying to make a joke. I think we really do. I've camped in caves, sometimes 2 or 3 nights running, staying in the cave for 48 hours or so. And it gets very, very dark in caves, darker than it does on the surface of the earth, because on the surface of the earth, we're never in absolute darkness. We're just in the shadow that the earth creates as it turns the sun away from us. To save batteries, one of the things that we do is we use as few flashlights as we possibly can. And when it's time to sleep, everyone turns off all of their light sources. And it gets very dark. It gets so dark you can't see your hand. You can't even feel the temperature difference in your hand. But there have been occasions in the caves when I have dreamed that I was seeing dark. And then I noticed the difference that when I wake up and I experience that, yep, it's in a cave, it's still dark, that's a qualitatively different experience. So from the point of view of first-person singular consciousness, there is a qualia difference there, a phenomenological kind of test. A blind man cannot sense the dark in the cave as being any different than the dark that they experience by not seeing outside the cave. They can experience temperature differences, they can experience other differences, but they don't experience what it is that is distinctively dark. We not only can sense darkness, we can also perceive it. That other qualitatively different kind of experience. It's also interesting, and I hadn't thought about this before until I had a conversation with one of my colleagues about an experience that he had in high school a couple of weeks ago. I thought I better put that pause there, although he's been in high school more recently than I have. An experience of seeing in the dark without necessarily seeing the darkness, a kind of an intriguing counter issue. His teacher had shot a good deal of film walking down a hallway that had no windows and was lit only by fluorescent bulbs. Some of you are ahead of me. When they went back and developed the film and they started running it, and the teacher, knowing what was going to happen, started running it at different speeds, what did they see the camera picked up? Anyone want to guess? Not only the flicker, they would actually see some frames that were black. Because fluorescent bulbs are constantly turning on and off. They're different than incandescent bulbs in that. Optically, the length of the stimulation of the retina is longer than the length of the strobe in the flickering light of the fluorescent bulb. That's why you and I don't see it. Because what the brain does, the eye picks it up, but the brain immediately adjusts that, and it sews together, if you will, all of those lighted images into one apparently continuous experience. So there we have another way of noticing that there really is something being experienced. The brain fusing the sequence of those snapshots, leaving out the little shortened ones in terms of optical stimulation. You also see that in some old movie films. If you don't have the projector queued up just right, lots of times it's the wheels on the stagecoach that are going backwards or something, because the pulsing of the film frames is not in link with the pulsing in your eyes. It gets slightly off, but you don't have blank frames there. You just don't see all of them. We're able to test and distinguish sense darkness and perceive darkness. So it's a reasonable hypothesis, I would argue, to consider dark as, at least philosophically, as ontologically and objectively real substance. In recent years, scientists have increasingly used the terms dark matter and more recently dark energy to refer to power sources in the cosmos that defy empirical observation. I have a film clip, a YouTube film clip, about 6 minutes, that will come on in a moment.
If you aim a big telescope in any direction, it'll see galaxies galore. 100 billion of them populate the visible universe, from little bits of fluff to giant elegant spirals like our own Milky Way. As the universe ages, though, the galaxies will fade away like the taillights of cars receding into the distance. The number of visible galaxies will drop from the billions to the millions to just a handful. Finally, in the far distant future, those last few beacons will fade as well, leaving each galaxy alone in the cosmic darkness. Such is the possible legacy of a force that makes the universe expand faster as it ages. Eventually, the expansion would become too fast for light to cross the void between galaxies in the visible universe. So far, we're still in the dark about this mysterious force. But scientists at the Texas Cosmology Center are joining the search for it, the search for dark energy.
Dark energy is our ignorance of what's going on in the universe right now. We think we have an idea for how the universe is supposed to expand. And so when we try to measure how fast the universe is actually expanding, it's wrong. It's actually expanding faster than what we think it should be. And that is what we call a dark energy.
In the 1920s, Edwin Hubble discovered that the universe is expanding, that all of the galaxies are moving away from each other. And the farther away they are, the faster they're moving, as a result of the Big Bang in which our universe was born. They're moving because space itself is expanding, making the universe bigger. For a long time, one of the key questions in astronomy was whether the universe would continue to expand forever, or whether there was enough matter with enough gravity to stop the expansion and even reverse it, eventually pulling everything together in a big crunch.
And for many decades, astronomers tried to detect the signs of the slowing of the expansion of the universe due to the mutual gravitational attraction of the galaxies. In 1998, it was discovered that, in fact, it's not slowing down, it's speeding up. And this is the sort of effect that can only be attributed to a dark energy, an energy in space itself.
In fact, this energy dominates everything else in the universe.
And from these various observations, we've concluded that the energy budget of the universe, as it is now, is about 4% ordinary matter. That is atoms, you, me, the sun, the moon, the stars. About 23% dark matter, which is matter but not ordinary matter, not ordinary atoms, but some kind of particles. And all the rest, about 70-some%, is dark energy.
A dark energy could be just a property of space itself. And that's the number one issue which people are considering at this point. And this is called the vacuum energy. Just the existence of space. Because space is there, there may be energy associated to that space. And the bigger space there is, the more energy there is. And that's one possibility, although the theoretical calculations are terribly off on trying to predict the magnitude of that dark energy contribution.
Another possibility is, which is quite interesting, however unlikely, is that there is something subtly wrong with Einstein's theory of general relativity, which governs the behavior of the universe on large scales, because it describes gravity, and gravity is the only force relevant in the universe on large scales. This is, however, unlikely because general relativity is a well-tested theory. In principle, it has so far served us very well in astronomy and cosmology. The other possibility is that general relativity is correct, we just are not applying it correctly to the universe.
Several teams of astronomers around the world are developing experiments to try to find the correct explanation for dark energy. Some of them will use the same technique that was used to discover dark energy in the first place, using a type of exploding star to measure the distances to other galaxies. When combined with measurements of how fast each galaxy is moving away from us, that should reveal how dark energy has changed through time, one of the keys to determining its true nature. Scientists at the University of Texas, with partners from around the world, are developing an experiment that will use a different technique. The experiment is HETDEX, the Hobby-Eberly Telescope Dark Energy Experiment. It'll use the giant Hobby-Eberly telescope at McDonald Observatory to measure how galaxies were distributed through the universe billions of years ago, a distribution affected by dark energy. And it'll test whether the energy of space itself changes over time.
Right now we're in a situation where the theorists sort of know no bounds. We've got to provide them with some boundary conditions. And in fact, what we need to do is just provide a really precise measurement of how the universe has expanded through time, against which they can test ideas. And it will probably be the case that once this measurement is in place, that 99% of the ideas, maybe all the ideas, are actually negated by it, and we find out that there's something else that we haven't thought of. But no matter what happens, any solution to dark energy is going to end up meaning fundamental change in our way we look at physics. The laws of nature will change as a result of explaining this.
So for those of us who do philosophy and don't have several hundred years to wait for the data to come in, physicists are experimenting. And there are some possibilities here. And again, the possibilities are going to kind of flow out of some of the notions that we are dealing with. You heard two pieces of what I'm interested in there. One is that dark energy may be a property of the universe itself, of the physical space itself, of the very full, complete dimensions of the universe itself. And if that's the case, there are all kinds of experimental things that physicists and microphysicists at the other end of the scale can be working with astrophysicists. One of those, and the notion of dark energy here, is that everything in the universe is expanding. It's not that galaxies are not growing and just moving away from each other. They are also expanding internally. And that kind of shocks you. I think that explains why I've gained some weight in the last 20 years, because dark energy is causing me to expand and take up more space than I'd used before. That probably is so subtle a measure that we're not going to be able to prove or disprove dark energy using that. But it raises that question of whether or not dark is not just a color, but dark is a substance, or is it a property of substances, including light or different than light? But the whole notion of the speeding up of the universe, I think, is an interesting thing to keep my imagination going. I do acknowledge that many astrophysicists speak of the high probability of the existence of dark matter and of dark energy, even though they don't have direct evidence of it. The fact that they are talking about it as a sort of reality, as a power process, which is a kind of an entity that ontologists would recognize. I'm proposing that dark does have ontological reality of its own, independently of light. Whether it's an entity or it's a process, could fit either of those descriptions. Dark, as we experience it, using phenomenological techniques as I did a while ago, and interpret the phenomenon, must be more than simply a qualification of light itself. There is something much richer going on here. A second kind of non-being, a second kind of nothing, is silence. I was going to try to do an experiment, but I remember the last time I was here that the radiators were rattling, so we would never come close to actually having silence. Some would describe silence as the absence or the privation of noise or sound. Silence does not resemble sound in terms of any of its descriptors. It has no loudness, it has no timbre, it has no pitch, so it seems to be different than the thing we claim it is the absence of. Sound, in our use of the term, is distinguished from acoustical silence, which would be white noise, the noise that we use to filter so that we can focus what we're working on. Noise that has no determinable phonemes or tones. It's not truly silence. What it really is a mixture of a bunch of other noises without pattern, without anything that would grab our attention, without intervals. It's just continuous. But parallel to our analysis of seeing dark, perhaps we can hear silence. If we could, that would help to establish the likelihood or probability of the hypothesis that silence is itself something, not just the absence of sound. In soundproof chambers used for hearing analysis, the experience of silence seems to have a qualitative aspect. People complain that it does. One can also introspect the absence of sensed sound. There's evidence that different neurons fire when simulated by silence than are fired when simulated by sound. So there seems to be a physiological, neurological counterpart to there being something out there that has a causal effect, called the experience of silence. These sound absences can be, I think, considered objective, at least in a minimal sense here. They're not fantasies. They're not just mental constructs that we use for the purpose of understanding. They are sensory givens. They are quantifiable in time and space. They have duration. They have location. There is, however, in my analysis, a striking difference between dark and silence. They're not the same kind of nothing, exactly. Dark is not a simple absence of light. It is a distinct objective stimulant to sight. It is an alternative to light in some cases. It includes part of the color spectrum, which we call black, and it can be mixed with light. Silence, objectively, is not a distinct stimulant to hearing. It is a relative gap between noises or constructed sounds. You experience silence as the in-between other sounds. And as such, it is measurable in time. And its meaning is given by its context, not by itself. Interpretation of sound would certainly be impossible without the ability to hear silence, which is why it is so important. We hear the beginnings and ends of words, of phonemes, as we pronounce them. In fact, we get pretty good at this. I remember when I was a kid, watching with as we had kids, watching on Sesame Street and Little Red Schoolhouse or whatever some of those programs were, there was a cartoon character who would sound out words on billboards. You just sound each letter by itself and then eventually merge them together and learn how to merge them together. That segmentation process of learning how to read, of learning how to imitate sounds and so on, is not unique to just human beings, but it is certainly part of the experience that there are changes of those sounds. There are starts and stops, hundreds of them, as you and I speak very, very simple sentences. But we learn how to make sense of them. It is not the garbled sound that you hear on, what's the voice? I think it's the teacher in Peanuts who does the wah, 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 wah kind of thing, where you don't have any discriminating breaks at all in that sound. A musical melody is as much the breaks between those sounded notes and chords as the sensation of the actual notes or the chords themselves. That is where a lot of the meaning of that piece of music, that's where the timbre for the music might be coming from. And whether it's verbal or musical, pacing and spacing of word, phrase, and thought units are important to the expression of the meaning. Segmentation and pauses produce phonetic units. There is a silence that you may remember in Hitchcock's Birds, where you suddenly notice all the birds who were chattering as they were gathering on those telephone lines suddenly aren't chattering anymore. That silence is extraordinarily scary. My children hated that part of the movie. I thought it was the birds pecking coming through the wood. No, it was the silence that happened, the anxiety that produced, the fear that produced. Hitchcock is a master at not just the video, but the sound in his film. It's when there is, if you remember in Jaws, there's the musical background when the shark is coming. Da-dum. And you kind of know where the shark is. You know he's coming, but the characters in the film don't. And that gets you anxious again, because you can hear that in the pauses in those two notes and the repetition of those two notes, anticipating the next time, because the very first time that happens in the film, the last dump is a mouth. A third kind of non-being is space. Can there be a vacuum, a state of nothing, a void, an emptiness entirely lacking of matter or of stuff of any sort? Is space, or any portion of it, really empty or full of nothing? Saying the same thing two different ways. Is space a sort of place where no thing is at a given moment? Is space the dimension of physical or material reality between physical stuff? Does space exist as a reality independent of things that might be present in it or pass through it, such as waves do? Does space have dimension? Does it have location? Does it have shape? Is it what the universe expands into, or is it that which shapes and creates spaces between the physical stuff that make up the universe? Does space exist outside the mind in its own objective reality? There are a number of conceptualizations of this. This is, compared to the other two forms of non-being, much richer in the publications of philosophy over the centuries, since Thales and Parmenides first started talking seriously about space and void. Our immediate concern here is, in what sense does space exist? I'm going to restrict myself just to doing ontology. I'm not worried about all of the implications in philosophy of science and others at this point. Our immediate concern is, in what sense does space exist? It exists in some sense, either as a mental construct, minimally, or having some kind of reality, or being part of the reality of something else. If it does not exist, then is it a kind of non-being? Is it a different sort of nothing than the other two that we've talked about already? We commonly use the word space to indicate a 2- or 3-dimension relationship between objects and events. For example, the distance between two cities, the gap between the flow of electrons inside an atom. We imagine that as space. Whether it is full or empty, you may want to argue about. In this sense, space has a very limited ontological status. Like time, it is not a substance. Its reality is borrowed. Its reality is contingent on the reality of the related objects or events that it is the gap between. Its emptiness of being is the relative absence of some stuff, of some power or energy or waves. As such, despite not being a substance, space may have, and this is curious, dimension. It can have magnitude of duration and distance. It can have shape, not as properties, but in terms of behaviors related to the objects that it is the space between. So it is quite different as a kind of nothing. As a mode of being, as propertied existence of the relationship of objects and events, space is objective. Its existence is not contingent on any knower. It does have an objective dimension. The fourth and last of our forms of nothing is zero. I tried to find 4 that would not be obviously interchangeable terms here. Those of you who are physical scientists, you can take your hands down now. Now the mathematicians need to excuse their consciousness from the room. Zero, alias, cipher, naught, nil, those are words that we commonly find in the vocabulary, is both a numeral and a number. And I have to make this distinction because it's really important. There's no doubt at all that 0 is a numeral. It is a symbol. We use it as a placeholder in number systems. In our decimal system, It separates the units from the hundreds, from the thousands, and I don't know how you learned math when you were a little kid, but you were working with the fact that 0 was the last of a series, not the first. The first was 1, and 0 was the last one, right? And then you would start another series. It's an even number. It's an integer. We can use it as a number for counting, for doing other mathematical processes, for doing calculations and proofs in geometry. And what we do with it when we're treating it as a number, not simply as a numeral, a convention, I don't know, it's probably not caught on nearly as well as the metric system has in this country yet, but you put a slash through the round 0 to indicate that you're using it as a number now, not just as a placeholder, not just as a numeral. Europeans are very finicky about making sure that you recognize what they're doing there. It is here where we're talking about number as it quantifies, because it quantifies the count of objects as nil. It's here that philosophers get interested. 0 indicates that the extension, I'm using technical, philosophical, logical terminology here for a moment, it's the extension of a category that's empty. There are no members in this set of things. That's what 0 does mathematically, and that's what we do logically. Say again, this means that the set of things one may be talking about is an empty set. So, the present King of the United States. How many are there? 0? None? Does that mean there's nothing? You heard Bertrand Russell in there? So, the present King of the United States is a class or a category of possible instances or possible people, right? You can actually give a definition of that. You can give a definition of what the requirements of it might be. You could even give more definition if you really wanted to be very precise, that it may have to belong to some particular family by inheritance and so on in order to become King of the United States. So we can have a definite idea here. The categories or universals, as we called them in the Middle Ages, do have meaning. They're not silly. They're not just abstractions. They're not made up. They're not just fictions. They're real uses of meaning, or units of meaning. But whether or not 0 is a number and how it works does have a parallel that's going on in logic that is really significant, because here we're not talking about nothing. We're talking about something rather important. If we take one of those empty sets that has no members in it, there are no instances of the present King of the United States, and make an argument out of this. If you would grant that the present King of the United States is bald, and if you would also grant that Barack Obama is the present King of the United States, it is logically necessary to conclude that therefore Barack Obama is bald. That is a perfectly valid argument. In fact, it's a Barbara, for those of you who studied logic. But there's a problem with it. And it's not a problem of fact, it's a problem of meaning. The first statement, you may say, is a question of fact, but can the first statement ever be a fact? It can't test as false or as true because you're talking about an empty set. And we know this already from mathematics. The same thing applies in the logic within philosophy. From any statement that has an empty set in it, you can conclude validly to any conclusion you want to. So this is really messy. You have to do something with it. Aristotle was really troubled. The father of even modern logic, Aristotle, could not deal with this. He had not dealt with the extension of the concept in an effective way. Medieval philosophers came up with alternate systems. At the beginning of the 20th century, we finally figured out a way to do it. We lay that investigation or that invention at the feet of Bertrand Russell, who probably stole it from a friend of his. We call this existential import. That as long as there are no members of a set, you cannot absolutely conclude to that conclusion. You can conditionally conclude to it. And the condition is that there had to be some member at some time in that set. Then at that time, that argument would be valid. So we're talking about something that is a kind of nothing here. Empty sets are kind of nothings. Unicorns have horns. Is a kind of an empty set. We haven't found any unicorns or any even indirect evidence of unicorns, but we can still think about that. We can still be very logical in our fantasies. But they only become realistic. You can only become not only valid but sound if you have existential import. And notice what this does. It saves the value of universals. We can talk in generalities. And even more important in philosophy, we can talk about possibles. We don't have to be talking about actuals all the time. We can spend a lot of time talking about what might have been, what might be, and still draw valid conclusions from that. So they allow us to deal with possible beings in a very effective way. The function of zero in mathematics and of existential import in philosophy are talking about nothings. They don't exist. They're empty sets. There are no instances of those cases, but we can still go there. And you go, well, how's that important? Free will. If there's a philosophical idea that grabs the attention of college students today, it's the question of free will. Without possibles, there is no such thing as free will. We would be trapped in the factness of the world and nothing else. But because we can imagine beyond what the world factually is, and we can make choices beyond the reality of what the world is, then philosophy now has a lot of work to do. So this is an important function, at least in a subjective sense. It's a kind of nothing we have to keep around. So as I keep telling my wife, nothing matters. We've examined several candidates of non-being: dark, silence, space, and zero. They all at one time or in some context have appeared to be instances of nothing. They may appear to be nothing in the sense of being the mere absence of something else, or they may appear to be nothing as the deprivation or the privation of something else. Yet ironically, nothing might seem to never exist. Indeed, nothing would seem to not even be a category of being. The cynic might say that nothing only exists because we think of it. And to bring this home, I found a good little clip without giving away any of the rest of the story, because I don't want to ruin it for you, of a book that came out, I believe, in 1983. I remember watching a movie that was made of it a year or two later with my kids. And my guess is most of you have seen it. The Never-Ending Story. And one of the principal characters in the story is nothing.
Where I come from in the north, we used to have exquisite gourmet rocks. Only now, they're all gone.
I know how it happened.
I swear it wasn't me.
No, I think I know what it was. Tell us more.
Near my home, there used to be a beautiful lake. But then it was gone.
Did the lake dry up?
No, it just wasn't there anymore. Nothing was there anymore. Not even a dried up lake.
A hole?
A hole would be something. No, it was nothing. And it got bigger and bigger. First, there was no lake anymore, and then finally, no rocks.
If he keeps stuffing his face like that, soon there won't be any rocks here either.
Nighthawk, this could be serious. Rockbiter, what you have told us is also happening where I live in the West. A strange sort of Nothing is destroying everything.
Yes. We night hubs live in the south. And it's there too.
So, it's not just in our part of Fantasia?
Maybe it's already everywhere. Maybe our whole land is in danger. What can we do?
Any of you not seen that? You've never seen that? If you have teenagers, you need to see it with them. They will love it, and they'll love you for having found it. I won't tell you how the story ends. And if you're philosophically minded, you'll love some of the plot depths that are going on in here. This is assuming that nothing exists, as you see in the film, perhaps only in our mind. With that, I would disagree. Or you might read this film as saying that nothing does exist in reality, and that it is not something, it is nothing, and it is important. Nothing is important. Nothing amazes us. It grasps our imagination. Nothing represents all the possibilities that can ever be actualized or not yet actualized. Nothing represents the radical freedom that we humans exercise. We have the raw capacity to choose even nothing. Nothing represents the paradox that this world is contingent on the will of a loving creator. I joined Lewis Carroll of Alice in Wonderland fame for his fascination with the idea of nothing being more than what meets the eye. You may remember this passage. "Take some more tea," the March Hare said to Alice very earnestly. "I've had nothing yet," Alice replied in an offended tone, "so I can't take more." "You mean you can't take less," said the Hatter. "It's very easy to take more than nothing." Nothing and non-being are certainly beings of reason, but they are, I would argue, more, much more. Richard Feynman used to go up to people all the time, and he'd say to them, "You won't believe what happened to me today. You won't believe what happened to me." And they would always say, "What?" And he would say, "Absolutely nothing." I trust and pray that a great deal of nothing will happen to you in what remains of today, that perhaps some dark happens to you, perhaps some zero harm, and perhaps some silence. Thank you. I'll take a few questions from scientists or mathematicians as well, but my answer probably is going to be, I don't know.
From theology, I take the next step to evil.
Sure. I was afraid to go there. I'm glad you did, Father.
Is the absence of good? Is it?
Or is it something of its own? Are evil and good at war with each other, or is evil just what good is missing? Yeah, if I were to follow through on this consistently, I would have to say evil is something. Evil is something that can be caught. Evil is something that we can do. It is more than just subjective illusion. It is more than just subjective perception.
Can you say more about nothingness and freedom, and how possibility and nothingness?
Well, there's two sides of that, I think. One is that if we're only stuck with facts and we can't think of things that do not exist, have not existed, or maybe will not exist, having a world that has possibilities in it offers us some choices. That's one aspect of it. And the other aspect is, even when we are somewhat compelled, even when the deck is loaded, so that we can't do anything except what is going to happen, we can still say no. And an example that I often use in class that's kind of harsh, but I think it gets the point across. If I'm skydiving and jump out of the airplane and I pull the cord and the chute doesn't open, and the backup cord chute doesn't open either, I'm going to splat. Right? Determinism. But I still have free will. I don't have free will about splatting, but I have free will about, oh, I'm going to go fighting and screaming all the way down, or this is a cool opportunity to see what this looks like from the inside. So you still have the possibilities of exploring even counterfactual reality. And that I think is a distinctive feature of human beings. And I think that's crucial to the notion of free will. So if we don't have nothing, we lose an awful lot of the argument on free will, I think. Yes? Would you identify yourself so people can pick on you later, or?
My name is David Staples.
Whatever you want to say. You're a student here?
I'm not a student.
Okay.
I'm starting school next year.
Okay.
I was thinking about what you said about noise and with like atonal dissonance, how we just don't recognize what nothing would sound like, because it's just a bunch of things coming together and making non-patterns. Applying that to like space and how light works and anything, rather than absorbing darkness, since darkness is going to be there after the light's gone, rather than like taking in all this darkness, would it actually just pull it into just like lines and like pulling everything into order and stuff, rather than...
You're using a visual metaphor for sound here. I suppose you could if you have equipment that actually translates it into sound images. And I have no idea what silence would look like. My guess would be a flat line makes sense, because we have that metaphor from medicine. But I'm not sure if the screen would go blank, simply because there's no data to be interpreted by the screen.
Because of like patterns and stuff, it's like scale.
Right, right.
So it's just putting
There's no timbre. There's no timbre, there's no pitch. I mean, you're losing a couple of ingredients that you're analyzing in sound analysis. You're losing them. So I don't know what would be the best metaphor for that machine to model for me. But a flat line makes some sense, except that could be a constant, no deviation in the sound production. I'm not sure what it would look like translated into a visual image. We have the same problem in inner space. When people are making films of what atoms and subatomic particles are doing, they almost always add sound to it, and they add color to it, but it's so small that there isn't any color. It's too small to be in the color spectrum. And so we have to artificially do something to it to make it interesting, to bring it back into the human scale of experience. So it is objective, I would still argue. It's still out there, except it's not everywhere in the universe. Sound and color are not everywhere in the universe. So dark might not be either. Oh, here comes the chemist. Sister.
I'm in physical science, and I found your discussion of dark energy very interesting, because I guess a physical science would define energy as kind of an umbrella thing, and so light's a form of energy, heat's a form of energy, matter is a form of energy.
What I'm understanding them to say, that it's a new kind of energy, okay, at a new dimension than... Yeah, well, there's both dark matter and dark energy, and both of them have not been on our threshold of observation before. They're only indirectly hypothesized. They're not claiming that they exist, but they're claiming that this is the best explanation for these strange phenomena that we had not expected. So if you approach this in terms of cause and effect theory, which a lot of science I understand works with, that if you can explain a phenomenon in terms of a series of antecedent causes or conditions, then you've identified all the causes that go into making up this event, this effect. And that what they've discovered is the rules of physics, especially at an astrophysical level, it's coming out different. We're getting different data. Instead of, if the whole universe is made up of physical bodies and empty space, then at some point it should start slowing down because gravity ought to start making all of those bodies that have been flying away from each other because of the Big Bang, or whatever you hypothesize at the beginning end of it, they ought to start slowing down and start coming back together and collapsing into a primeval ball of something, right? Except what they've discovered in the last 120 years, when they look back at the data, there was a slowdown of the red shift, but what's actually happening is that the pace of the galaxy moving is actually accelerating. It's not that you're driving the car down the road at the same speed. Someone's got their foot in the accelerator, and they're flying apart faster and faster and faster. Not only the galaxies, but everything in the universe is expanding in every part of the universe faster than it was before, at a faster rate than it was before. And there's nothing in the formulas that Newtonian physics has that accounts for that. So the X factor is called dark energy. And they've assigned some properties to it. And as you saw here, one report, that was the Texas, I think, group, see it to be taking up at least 73% of the total space of the universe. That it's just a huge amount to explain the fact that acceleration is happening. The scary part, if you're going to be around for 50 million years, is that the edges of the universe are going to disappear because as it accelerates, it's going to be flying away from us and from everything else faster than the speed of light does. It's not flying into anything, it's just flying farther apart. It's expanding. There's nothing to go into because space itself is not a thing, at least as I understand them. Yeah. It's fun to speculate in this stuff. And because there are no rules in ontology, we can get away with more. Anything else? Go watch the movie, The Never-Ending Story, if you've never seen that. Get it on Blu-ray or online or something. Read the book is better. Yes?
I'm Julie.
Sure.
I'm one of your students.
I remember you.
It reminds me when you talk about space of the human experience of, you start out as this little thing, you grow and expand, you reach a point.
And then you start shriveling as you get older.
And then the energy goes away and goes back into the universe, and then it starts all over it. It's maybe like, to me, life is more of a process rather than a thing.
Oh, I would agree with you.
The universe is.
Yeah, I would agree with you too. Yeah. I think that's true of people.
Do you think the universe is like that too?
I'm not sure. If they're right, that just added another big chunk of time before the pullback, before the oscillation back occurs. But I grew up in an age when oscillating universe was the theory. And what we're finding now is physicists are saying, oh, no, that was wrong.
There was, in PBS, there was a thing about that. I think the guy's name was Green.
Yes.
And he was
that may be mentioned. Did I get that on that sheet? There's a series on Nova that I suggested. I think it's 4 hours, or is it 4 parts? I can't remember which. It began broadcasting last fall. That is an amazing piece. And he's well respected in the world of physics too. But I think Nova still has that. I think you can download it. It's an amazing, and the graphics are just amazing. And he plays around as the one fellow in this mentioned, the physicists who are playing with ideas. They're just having fun. They're out of control at this point because they're coming up with all kinds of variations to explain this. And now what we have to do is we have to get the numbers. We have to get the measurements. So we have to be able to measure drift in the universe precisely so we can start throwing out the ideas that don't work.
I don't mean to take up too much time, but I thought maybe I might try a philosophical trip.
Sure. You want to-
Nanoparticles of gold are black. Do they?
Oh, I love that.
Do they have color?
The nanoparticles? Once we break gold down into its...
Yeah, nanoparticles are black.
Huh.
Do they have color?
That is...
Test and see if you believe that black is
Yeah.
a color.
It is a color. It's not a color of light. There is no such thing as black in the light spectrum. But people have often associated black with nothing because of that. Late medievals were already doing that. They knew that black was not in the color spectrum. Right. And for our imaginations, I think that makes sense, because what we see in space, I think, gives us some support for claiming this, that once we get into emptiness, what is the appropriate color to imagine that to be? Well, we think of the sky being black with white spots in it. But apparently physicists say that when you get to a small size, too, color cannot happen, because the color spectrum is too big for that size, that you're smaller than any band in the spectrum would be. So again, what are you going to pick? You're going to pick white? Well, that'd be all the colors. So black is a logical kind of inference. But this even makes it more likely.
Even Edgar Allan Poe wrote, talk about the golden wall. If there were so many millions of stars, if they all would reach our eye, the edge of the universe would be totally light. And that's what he called the golden wall. Because it was lit up like an individual star, but it was like, so very,
Cool.
see, even Poe even did a little thing in this universe.
Good, thank you. I don't want to keep you. Supper is waiting, and the Darksucker is going to be setting soon.